Welcome, all of you. Nice to see you here. Nice to see that the world is beginning to travel again, and you're pioneers in this effort to once again become mobile. The Zoom conferences are okay for making presentations, but they're not very good at all for interchanges, and they're worthless for negotiations. So it's important that we get back to face-to-face meetings, and so glad to see you here. We're going to discuss first the worldwide denunciation against coercive, unilateral, and illegal measures. And I congratulate you on your coalition, which is extremely important. And I think it's a cutting edge, really, of the fight against imperial, colonial, and neo-colonial mentality in the world today. So once again, I congratulate you. The coercive, unilateral, illegal measures applied to Nicaragua include the NICA Act, which is called the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act. It seeks to back loans to block loans from international financial institutions to the government of Nicaragua unless it undertakes effective measures to hold free, fair, and transparent elections. It was sponsored by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. I really don't think his constituents in Midland, Texas care very much about Nicaragua, but he felt more oriented towards Miami than Odessa, I think, when he proposed this NICA Act. Then there's the Magisti Act, which the Congress passed in 2012, which was aimed at Russian officials, but it's cased in universality. It's like it makes the U.S. a vigilante in the world. And since 2016, the bill, which applies globally, authorizes the U.S. government sanctions its seas with regard to its view of human rights offenders. They freeze their assets and prohibit them from traveling to the United States. There's also some decrees, and one decree I would like Claudia to come up with a number and date of the decree on Nicaragua, which was applied in several cases, including mine, which has a very interesting clause in it, and that clause says that any official of the Nicaraguan government who served from 2007 onward can be subject to these coercive measures. That is a pretty big statement. Any official who has served in the government since 2007 can be subject to coercive measures. Pull that up, and we're going to announce it, the name and number of that statute. That means that the U.S. government is not recognizing the Nicaraguan elections of 2006, 2011, and 2016, in which President Ortega was elected with 38% of the vote, 62% of the vote, and 72% of the vote. That means that the U.S. government denies the right of Nicaraguans to choose a political party and be a member of a political party, the right to serve in their government, since all of the governments since 2007 have been the Sandinista governments. Actually, that clause means that the United States officially looks at Nicaragua as a protectorate, not recognizing the laws, not recognizing the elections, not recognizing the right to have a political life, not recognize the right to serve in the government, not having the right to exercise one's basic civil and humanitarian rights.
Esta es la primera que se hizo, que es la
Este que
Magisti.
explicó a mí, cuál es el mío esto. This is Executive Order number 13851 of 27 November 2018, called Blocking the Property of Certain Persons Who Contribute to the Situation in Nicaragua. And so I will read these parts from it. All of the goods and interests in the United States of America that and subsequently will be called United States, or that might subsequently enter into the possession or control of any person in the United States, of designated persons, cannot be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or dealt with in any manner. The entry of such persons in the United States as immigrants or no immigrants is suspended, except when the Secretary of State determines that the entrance of the person is in the national interest of the United States.
Aquí al final está la específica para usted.
Ya, ok. Pues quiero lo del 2007. The realization of donations of any type specified under Section 203B2 of IEEPA 50 United States Code 1702B2 in the benefit of any person whose property or interest in our block would gravely damage the capacity to confront the national emergency declared in this order. Nicaragua represents a danger to the United States and declares a national emergency because of the existence of Nicaragua. The prohibitions of this order include the realization of any contribution, provision of funds, goods, or services for, and the benefit of any person whose goods or interests and property are blocked in conformity with this order. The reception of any contribution, provision of funds, goods, or services of any of these persons. Any transaction that evades or tries to avoid this proposition is a violation or intent of a violation of these provisions is hereby prohibited. Any conspiracy formed to violate any of these provisions established under this law is also prohibited. So here we have another gem, which is Executive Order 13618 of 20 December 2017, blockage of property of persons involved in grave abuses of human rights or corruption, and orders the same thing. So this is what we're discussing, and these measures are totally and absolutely illegal. The only sanctions that are legal in international law are those approved by the United Nations Security Council. The United States, European Union, Great Britain, Canada, and somehow most recently Switzerland have engaged in this illegal activities. So the imposition of unilateral coercive sanctions against institutions, countries, and individuals are completely illegal in international law. They reflect a colonial or neo-colonial superiority complex, the same impulse that drove imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, by self-appointing themselves as world policemen, world watchmen, exercising simultaneously the functions of police, prosecutor, judge, jury, jailer, and with the aggravating factor of extraterritoriality. Not only within the United States, it's projected to be effective with extraterritoriality throughout the world, outside the framework of international law. These are the remnants in the 21st century of the mentality that the imperialists, colonialists, and neo-colonialists had, who felt morally superior to the South, to the blacks and the browns, and sought to tutor them, control them, and impose their will on them. Of course, these coercive measures violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that verses in Article 21A, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. So as you can appreciate, the provision in the decree that says any official who has been in the Nicaraguan government since 2007 violates Article 21A of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. Also, and we must invoke Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinions, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, and international status of the country, or jurisdictions or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it is independent, trust, non-self-governing, or any other limitation of sovereignty. So it's a clear, they're illegal, they're not contemplated in international law. Who appointed the United States, Great Britain, the European Union, and Canada to be the world's policemen? Who appointed them to judge others in terms of human rights? In Geneva, there's the United Nations Human Rights Council, right? There are meetings of the Human Rights Group in Geneva, which is a proper way to address those issues. The way these measures are applied violate all human and civil rights also. It's quite ironic they apply a measure saying it's to protect human rights when the measure in and of itself violates all human and civil rights. Why? There's no charges, no presumption of innocence, no right to defense, and even if you could get a lawyer, you couldn't pay him because you're a designated person. And the lawyers are wary too because of that phrase that says anyone who has a conspiracy to obviate this can also be punished. I've experienced that. No right to due process, no right to a trial, and we go further in terms of the application of the measures. No right to own legally derived property. Legally gotten property is frozen, or to engage in economic transactions. There's only what exists are administrative measures without judicial recourse. That is a huge violation of the civil rights of all. Administrative measures, in this case of the U.S. Treasury, without any judicial recourse. It's the worst nightmare of Franz Kafka. It's a Kafkian nightmare. It's the worst nightmare of 1984. It's Orwellian that the state prohibits the civil existence of people. So they become economic zombies. They become without any economic rights. The political constitution of Nicaragua states that the independence, and this is Article 1, hard fought and won through decades and centuries of struggle, independence, sovereignty, and national self-determination are inalienable rights of the people and the basis of the Nicaraguan nation. Any foreign interference in the internal affairs of Nicaragua or any attempt to undermine these rights threaten the lives of the people. It is the duty of all Nicaraguans to preserve and defend these rights: the right to sovereignty, independence, and self-determination. And these measures are obviously a massive interference in Nicaraguan internal affairs and politics and government. Chapter 1, verses on individual rights. To individual liberty, to their security, to the recognition of their personality and legal capacity, to their private life and that of their family, to respect for their honor and reputation. Citizens have the right to elect and be elected in periodic elections and to run for public office, except for the limitations contemplated in the Constitution. So once again, the decree is violating international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Nicaraguan law. As an aggravating factor, the United States claims extraterritoriality for its laws and administrative measures, but it rejects the application of international law internally in the United States. There you see the definition of a power that thinks itself imperial. That its laws are mandated throughout the world, but international law is not applicable to the United States. It also applies coercive measures to third parties. Now this is another further step in terms of the intensity of these violations. So a third party who does not recognize or abide by a unilateral, coercive, illegal U.S. measure is also criminalized and can be penalized by the United States utilizing its illegal extraterritorial measures. We have the example recently of the arrest in Vancouver, Canada, of the financial officer of Huawei and daughter of the founder of the Chinese telecommunications firm, Huawei, by a warrant of the United States that Canada honored, accused of violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. That's the accusation. So here is a third party from China who is accused of not abiding by U.S. extraterritorial sanctions and arrested and awaiting extradition. A judicial process is underway. Financial blockades to influence trade policy, blackmailing, extortion with regard to political behavior, or even for much larger purposes, such as destabilization of government, regime change, coup d'etats. Actually, we need to raise consciousness that U.S. interventionism in Latin America was not left behind with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and the gunboat diplomacy and the dollar diplomacy of that period. There have been 8 coups d'etats and attempted coups d'etats in Latin America in this century. There was Venezuela in 2002, in which Comandante Hugo Chavez was captured and taken to an island. And it took the reaction of the Nicaraguan people, a segment of the army, and a strong international reaction to revert that very serious coup attempt. And the person who was directing the coup from the Miraflores Palace in Caracas was continually communicating with the Undersecretary of State for American Affairs. In 2004, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was taken out of the president's office by U.S. military and thrown out of the country. A direct military intervention to create a coup d'etat, as well as a CIA invasion from Dominican Republic to bring in some reinforcements. In 2009, there was the coup against Mel Zelaya, the 28th of June of 2009. And it was actually 2 coups, a Thursday coup that was organized by the United States, and a Saturday night coup after the other one had failed, organized by the right wing, the really fascist right wing in Honduras. So that was denied by the United States, but Hillary Clinton's a glutton for taking credit for things. So in her biography, she makes it very clear that she had met with the chair of the parliament, who was subsequently named the acting president, and enthusiastically backed the coup attempt in her role as Secretary of State of the United States. Then in 2010, Rafael Correa was going to the police to talk to them about a police law. He was taken prisoner, taken to the police hospital, and then Secretary of Foreign Relations Patino organized a street in Quito, and the army units came in and shouted out with the police to free President Correa from that coup attempt. In 2012, we have a coup in Paraguay against President Lugo, and this was steeped in the new modus operandi of the institutional coup, which also took place with regard to the first coup attempt, the U.S. coup attempt on Thursday. You had the Parliament, the head of the Parliament, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court justices, had all turned against the executive and were trying to remove the president. This happened with Lugo. There was an incident on a farm. The police shot some campesinos. They blamed the president in a staged operation that led to this institutional coup. Idem in 2016 in Brazil, where Dilma, in her second term, was removed by the Congress for having moved money from one budget allocation to another. I've been in public administration for 40 years. I don't know any government that doesn't do that, to move the funds around according to the necessities. But they use that pretext to overthrow Dilma and then criminalize the Workers' Party and go after Lula to try to eliminate him from the presidential election, which they did last time, paving the way for Bolsonaro and an openly fascist government that is stealing Indian lands, turning a blind eye to massacres of Indians in the Amazon, turning a blind eye to the mining and forestry interests, undertaking a great depredation, even turning a blind eye to COVID-19, emulating his model, who you are all familiar with. And then we have the coup d'etat in Nicaragua in 2018. They'd been trying to come up with something for quite a while. There had been people trained in some U.S. finance institutes and academies in social communication, young communicators, and the Einstein Institute, George Sharp, Colored Revolution methodology. And that was applied. They tried to get it started with the canal, very strangely because it was in an area the canal wasn't going to go through. But they made some campesinos fearful that they were going to get a bad deal if their lands were taken for the canal, which they weren't even going to be taken. The canal wasn't going that way. Anyway, that turned out to be localized and short-lived. Then there was price of the beans. They tried to mobilize on the basis of that. That didn't work. And then there was a forest fire in the Indio Maiz Reserve. And the Costa Ricans showed up at the border with some fire trucks. And Nicaragua said, no, thank you. Mainly because there's no way to get in fire trucks to where that fire was. And it was finally put out with the help of some neighboring countries that sent the boron-bearing airplanes and water-sucking airplanes and helicopters to douse the blaze in the profundity of a very virgin forest reserve. But they did some demonstrations on that, and that didn't work out. And then in April 2018, there was a law passed that was going to change the Social Security law. Before that, something had happened. And this is important to understand that coup. The NICA Act was introduced by Ted Cruz. Once again, I'm sure that people in Houston and Dallas were clamoring for the NICA Act. But he was pleased. He was with Ross Lieutenant, with Marco Rubio, with the senator from New Jersey, Mendez. They were all looking for how to do damage to Nicaragua. They would have preferred to do damage to Cuba, but that wasn't in the cards. They were already doing damage to Venezuela, so Nicaragua was a good candidate to harass. And so this NICA Act was brought up. And that had a deleterious effect on Nicaraguan politics because Nicaragua had had a tripartite scheme for economic legislation. This is the International Labor Organization scheme. And the ILO conferences in Geneva, you have the government, you have the unions, and you have the owners. The three show up, and they negotiate the ILO resolutions. And Nicaragua was one of the few countries in the world, I don't know if there's another really, that implemented that. And the government was meeting with the unions and with COSEP, the umbrella organization of the private sector, to negotiate the economic laws, to even negotiate between the three of them the minimum wage year after year. So it was all done by consensus, which has led to great social stability and labor peace. You don't hear about strikes in Nicaragua because it's all negotiated with the participation of the unions and the owners and the government. But when the NICA Act was introduced, I'm sure you all know baseball, a part of the right wing said, oh, the U.S. is changing the signal. It's to hit and run. So they pulled out. And in 2018, they didn't approve the minimum wage. They didn't approve. They were withdrawing from collaboration with the government because the U.S. was changing policy, which it was. And then the negotiation for this Social Security reform comes up, and they don't come through with it. They don't come through with it. The law itself was benign, was mispresented, and it was not adequately explained before it was issued. That's a self-criticism. So that misinformation, fake news could take hold. What it was going to do was, and this the COSEPs didn't like, raise the employer's share of the Social Security payment, the payroll deduction, from I think it was 19 to 21%. It was 2 percentage points. They didn't like that. And it was going to put a 5% capture on the pensions, which would give the pensioners the same right as those secured for health benefits. So they would have the same health benefits as the insured people in the Social Security scheme. But that was misrepresented, saying that they were going to take money away from the poor pensioners who received so little funding. Anyway, the street was heated up through fake news. Day two, there was an absolutely fake account that a student had been killed in the Central American University, UCA. That was absolutely fake news, invented. The fourth day, the measure on the Social Security is withdrawn. But you can see clearly that it's a pretext, because the movement rapidly expands to cities throughout the country. And then begin the different stages of this process. Very much according to Gene Sharp's manual of the Einstein Institute. How many of you have seen that, The Colored Revolution? Several of you have. And so it was according to that. They tried to create victims, create the government as oppressor, take public buildings. In this case, they were burned. The City Hall in Granada was burned. The Student Center in Leon was burned. The Artisan House in Granada in Masaya was burned. Other municipal installations in Masaya were burned. Government vehicles were burned. Government equipment, construction equipment was destroyed. And then there was a looting phase. And the looting phase, to me, is very, very interesting in terms of doing a study of this, because people came up in motorcycles to break open the police stores. The police stores are owned by Walmart, and they specialize in low-end, low-price mass distribution. It's the Nicaraguan version. There's a Walmart store too, but this is the Nicaraguan version of the Walmart model in the U.S. So it's reaching publics that the others don't reach by doing it with low prices. So the poor people buy their rice and beans and their cooking oil and sometimes tortilla flour from Walmart. So they would break into the Walmart, and some of them would go out into the neighborhood to gleefully announce that there's a looting party. They're being invited to a looting party at the Pavi, which is open for looting. While their cohorts are mobilizing these people, they get into the cash registers and take out the money. And then something that strikes me as very interesting. They break into the ATM machines and steal the money from the ATM machines. And that takes a little bit of technology, because the ATM machines are not made to be broken into too easily. And you can torch them, but you can burn the money. But these people knew how to do it without burning the money, to open up the ATM machines and get the money out. And then when the people come in and start to loot, they move on to another pali or another store to apply the same modus operandi. But the targeting of the pali, I think, is very interesting, because it was an attempt to damage the supply of food for the for the most popular elements, the most marginal elements, the most vulnerable elements in Nicaragua's society who have low income, low savings, low capacity to deal with a shutdown like that. Then there begins terrorism campaigns of neighborhood invasions and house invasions in targeting of Sandinistas and real atrocities. What was the date of Arauz Pineda? It's early on, right? It's April or May? Find out the date of Arauz Pineda. A Sandinista companion is captured near the Opoli University, and they're filming this because the terrorists filmed. They're very much into the digital age. They filmed their crimes. And so he's laying there in the street, and they start to burn his body. You don't know if he's alive or dead, but they torch his body, and they filmed that. There's other instances of that too. And they were capturing municipal officers, and in the shadow of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, they were stripped naked. And this is to break down their will, to make them feel horrible, to break down their self-esteem. So they would torture them without clothes, tied up, when they captured Sandinistas. And then there was the threats by, for example, in a neighborhood, you wake up in the morning and all of the Sandinista houses have a mark on it, like the Nazis putting the Star of David on the Jewish houses in the build-up to the Nazi control. So they applied that type of terror too. But the most significant thing was to set up blockades, tranques. Some in the cities, but they started to blockade all of the highways to Managua. And this was very clearly to stop the food supply from coming into the capital. And so this interrupted commerce, interrupted Central American commerce. A lot of these freight liners you see got trapped. And then you had these tranques were crime centers. They would extort money from people. They would have people pay to get through the tranque. Some of them with medical problems. Ambulances were stopped. People died because the tranques blocking off the flow of medicine, the flow of patients, as well as people being captured and people being kidnapped, tortured, and then assassinated. So you'll see some things like housing development. Bismarck Martinez, who was a city worker, a Sandinista, worked in the parks department of the municipality of Managua. They captured him on one of these tranques. They took him to Carazo. They tortured him, and they murdered him. It took a while to find his body, but they filmed it too. So you had the films of the people who did these horrific crimes. So Bismarck Martinez is the symbol of the person who is in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they pick him up and they torture him, and then they murder him. These tranques were particularly acute in Masaya, where the police station was put under siege for over 2 weeks. The siege of the police station in Masaya. And it was, they couldn't go out. Their food supply and water supply were running out. They were surrounded and they were outgunned. And finally a column went into the equipment yard of the Masaya mayor's office, and then they drove through and liberated the police station. What is the headline? We'll talk about the media in a minute. What is the headline in the world? Immediately, Sandinista police enter Masaya to repress the population. That's the headline. In the United States, Europe, with all of the resonance that the CIA and its associates can move. And that is another aspect of this, is the aspect of the media campaign, the social media campaign, and the managing of the message. It is Goebbels. I know that sounds extreme, but it is pure Goebbels. It's the big lie repeated 1,000 times, becoming a media fact. And the Guardian quotes some source in Nicaragua. The Times of London quotes the Guardian. Der Spiegel quotes the Times of London. And they start to create a media fact that has no basis in reality. It is the big lie. And the big lie in this case is that this was not a coup attempt, but rather peaceful demonstrations against the Social Security law that the government viciously repressed. And everything else we're talking about is not there. It's not even in the human rights reports. I am a PhD in political science. I studied at the University of California, Berkeley. But I studied international law there. You have to have that course as part of the PhD in political science. And within that, there's human rights. I had no idea how biased the human rights structure is in and of itself. Because when you say, why in these reports is Arauz Pineda not there? Why is Bismarck Martinez not there? And the response would be from the people of the OAS and the people of the private human rights organizations, because the governments have the duty to protect. So it's the government's failing if these terrorists are slaughtering people. And this is a coup d'etat attempt. You see how bizarre that is, how surrealistic to say the government must protect all the citizens against the people who are trying to overthrow the government. Give me a break. And that's the way the human rights reports come out. But also, they have another big failing. They quote domestic sources that are completely biased, like Vilma Nunez's human rights organization, which has been anti-government from the get-go and has been trying to do damage and destabilize the government for years. But they quote them as a credible source. Pedro Joaquin Chamorro and Confidencial is seen as the independent Nicaraguan media. The independent Nicaraguan media says, when it's one of the prime outlets of U.S. financed propaganda. They're financed completely by the United States, his operation. Every single election in Nicaraguan politics, the U.S. has intervened in. There's not one that the U.S. has not intervened in, which makes quite funny when people get upset about, oh, the Russians might have intervened in the 2016 election, when the U.S. has intervened in every single U.S. Nicaraguan election. In 1924, 1928, and 1932, the Electoral Commission was formed by U.S. Marines and led by a U.S. Admiral. So that takes care of that period. And in 1984, 1990, 1996, 2001, 2011, and 2016, the U.S. was always managing the opposition, financing the opposition. Frente Sandinista is up against the U.S. in every election. The big adversary is the U.S. Their instrument are the local politicians who they crack their heads to try to get them into unified candidacy. And they'll try to do that again this year. The opposition is very divided, but you'll see heads cracking, money flowing, and all of a sudden they'll probably come up with a unified candidate. Now, the lifting of the tranques was violent. The imposition of the tranques was violent. The tranques were maintained by violence and criminal activity. And when the police backed by the community, started to taking them out, there were gunfights all over the place. So, in the result of the peaceful demonstrations, within quotation marks, with the lifting of the tranques, was 22 police killed by bullets and 401 police officers wounded by gunfire. Take that in a minute. 22 police dead and 401 wounded by gunfire. Then look up how many U.S. soldiers have died in Vietnam in Afghanistan. I'm defaced by decades. In Afghanistan in the last 2 years, and 401 police wounded. But the people won. The constitutional order was maintained. Afterwards, you can see the intent of the golpe with the consigna, que se vayan ya. They should go now, go now. That was the main slogan. And then when there was the negotiations, they confused the negotiation table with a rendition table, that the president was supposed to resign, and they were requesting his immediate resignation. They were asking for rendition, surrender, not a negotiation. Afterwards, the government amnestied those arrested for these crimes. That was a bitter pill to swallow, I'll tell you that. But in the interest of national reconciliation, national unity, we are the government of national reconciliation and national unity. We did reconcile with the Contra in 2006, and that contributed to the electoral victory. Because in all the elections, 1996, 2001, 2016, the government, the opposition and the U.S. always said, oh, if the Sandinistas win, you'll go back to the war. You'll go back to the privations of the 1980s, of the lack of goods, of the suffering, of the draft, the voluntary military service, compulsory military service rather. So that was the warfare. But in 2006, Daniel Ortega made a coalition, managed to pull that off with the Contra. So both the resistance and Yatama were in the coalition, United Nicaragua Triumphs. And that led to the triumph of the coalition, because it wasn't credible to say we're going to go back to the war when all the national parties to the war are in the same political coalition. And that wasn't nominal either. It wasn't nominal. The vice presidency was given to Jaime Morales Carrasco, who had been spokesperson of the Contra. He'd even been the negotiator of the Contra in Sapua, one of the negotiators. So he was vice president, a heartbeat away from the presidency, and they got several other posts too. So an attempt was made for national reconciliation by giving them the amnesty, to no effect whatsoever. It was ignored internationally. The media immediately kept up the attacks, and the social media campaign, it actually went up. They said, oh, the government's saying that if these people have a reincidence in the crimes they committed, the amnesty is off, they'll go back to jail. What do you mean? They have a right to have a reincidence in the crimes they committed? They have a right to that? Of course there can be no reincidence in the crimes they committed, the tortures, the murders, the kidnappings, the deprival of the Nicaraguan people of their civil and human rights through these tranques and the other measures. This lasted until July. It was 3 months. April, May, June, and in July it was finally taken back. I want to give you one more example, and we'll come back to our mainstream. But it's very important to understand this, to realize how bogus the sanctions related to this coup attempt are. So I was in Europe doing interviews with international media, and one Sunday they tried to get something going in Romania. We have these big overpass bridges. So they got together and they were going to do a march. And the police showed up and they couldn't do their march. So they spread out into the local neighborhoods, harassing Sandinistas, invading homes, and there were confrontations as the neighbors sought to defend themselves. And one of the terrorists was killed in those melees. Every newspaper in Europe, BBC, France 24, Deutsche Welle, had the lead story of one death. They were cocked and ready to fire, thinking they would have a bigger event. But they only got one death, but they said, oh, let's go with that. One death by Sandinista repression in Managua. It was amazing. El País newspaper, The Guardian. The Guardian used to have a good reputation, but it's particularly filthy with regard to its treatment of Nicaragua and the Latin American coups. And that continues. The great lie continues. The Europeans continue reproducing the great lie. Now, this coup attempt has had very negative effects on the Nicaraguan economy. I would say tens of thousands of small firms and businesses folded because they couldn't take 3 months of no activity or no transportation, no communication. And of course, tourism was completely shut down. 120,000 workers lost their jobs. And you had an aftershock of this in the Nicaraguan economy. The Nicaraguan economy between 2011 and 2017 had been growing at 5% per annum. It was the third fastest growing economy in Latin America and the Caribbean, only behind Dominican Republic and Panama. But we went negative from +5 to -2.9. Then there was another -2 something. And then 2020 was minus also. The good news is that we're coming back. Employment is rising again. It was coming back, and then the COVID hit, and it affected business. It slowed down business, even though there was no lockdown in Nicaragua at any time. There was no closures of business in Nicaragua at any time. But it affects, plus the tourists weren't coming, and the tourist industry had become increasingly important. We're on the way back. We're on the way back as seen from July 2019 until now. The employment has been increasing month upon month. The central bank and the finance ministry predict that we're going to grow by 2.5% this year. The intelligence unit of the economists say we're going to grow by 3.5% this year. I completely understand the difference because the finance ministry and the central bank very astutely set the bar a little lower so they can make the goal and look good rather than setting it too high and failing. So that's part of the planning process, but it'll be over 2.5, I'll assure you. And then there's an amazing indicator. In 2020, look this up in Zapata. Look up the country with the greatest increase of exports in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's Nicaragua. +8%. +8%. Only 2 other countries were positive. That was Honduras and Costa Rica, +1%. And the rest negative, and some deeply negative. The region of Latin America and the Caribbean had a reduction of -13% in its exports. Nicaragua, +8%. What happened? Well, gold increasing by 33% in price helped, that's for sure. But the big surprises were in agriculture. The bean production was up 50% the exports in beans, $115 million in bean exports. The Nicaraguan farmers were feeding Nicaragua and neighboring countries that had shut down during the pandemic. So the Salvadorians and Hondurans were eating Nicaraguan beans. The Salvadorians were already doing that partially, but they have upped it. Guatemalans too. And some was sent to the ethnic markets in the United States, where the Salvadorians, Nicaraguans, others, Guatemalans, like Nicaraguan beans. So that happened because of the treatment of the pandemic. The number of deaths per 100,000 people in Nicaragua is 2.6. And the rest of Central America, the range is from 27 to 132. The US is 140 something. And Great Britain's 159 deaths per 100,000. And Nicaragua is 2.6. You can go to the hospitals and they're not overflowing. No convention centers have had to be mobilized to take sick people. There's no crisis in the intensive care units. I want to explain this very rapidly in three things. One, in 2007, President Ortega declared universal free health care and education. And it was followed up by giving public health a first priority. 18 hospitals were built. 6 more are under construction as we speak. There'll be 22 more added on after that by 2026. So Nicaragua has 77 public hospitals. Panama has 17 public hospitals. That doesn't mean that Panama has 17 hospitals. It has 17 public hospitals. Its health system is private. The public health system is an appendix to a private health care system. Here, the public health care system is the system, and private health care is an appendix for people who have the money and want to spend it with a private doctor. They have every right to go to the hospital and have free universal health care, including operations, including medicine. I'm hypertense, diabetic, with asthma, and everyone gets their attention through the Social Security or through the public health care system. But you don't only run health care with hospitals. The number of health care workers went from 22,000 to 36,000. The number of doctors from 2,700 to over 6,000, 6,100. And the expenditures in health care, both on the investment side and on the operation side, were sextupled, 6 times more. So Nicaragua was prepared when COVID-19 came. God forbid we would have received that in 2006 with the precarious healthcare system left by the neoliberal governments. There's a second reason. 1 month before the first case, based on information coming in on the news and from the World Health Organization, Nicaragua organized the protocols, designated 18 hospital units around the country to deal with the COVID cases, trained the staff of what was known of COVID and kept updating them as more and more became known about how to treat COVID-19. And this is one of the Nicaraguan secret weapons. 98,000 volunteers, the weapon of the great capacity for organization and mobilization of the Nicaraguan people, made more than 5 million house-to-house visits, informing every family with a pamphlet of how to deal, how to prevent, what actions to take, to stay safe from COVID-19. Accompanied, of course, by a media campaign. But just a media campaign doesn't tell you that everyone got the message. House-to-house visits as a reinforcement do. And then there was a hotline set up, free hotline for anyone who had questions about this, had questions about their symptoms, or had information about people who were sick. Third factor. When the cases came in, they were isolated. I was one of the first ones isolated. The reason being I came back from a meeting in Geneva, and as it turned out, 4 people at the Green Climate Fund meeting in Geneva turned up positive when they got back to their countries. So bloop, I went in for 10 days. The doctor visited me every day, took my temperature, looked at my health, looked at me, and made sure I was isolating. And that lasted for the period. But then one day I was talking to my boss, and he said, you know, Paul, our first Nicaraguan patient was on the same plane you were on from Panama. Bloop, another 10 days because of the patient from Panama, isolated, and nothing came of it. And then a friend of mine got sick when he was going to travel, tested positive, and was in his home. They kept phoning him and checking up on him, and they sent him the medicine. The ambulatory cases get the COVID medicine sent to their homes, free. So these are part of the issues, but there's another thing that I think was particularly brilliant I haven't heard of elsewhere. And that was that in April, everyone sitting here got a seasonal flu vaccination and a bacterial pneumonia vaccination in our workplaces. Think about that. Seasonal flu and bacterial pneumonia. You vaccinate the population against that, and you reduce the respiratory cases. Instead of having more hospitals, you reduce the respiratory cases, so there's more capacity for the medical institutions to treat the COVID-19, because you don't have the groundswell like every year of the seasonal flu and bacterial pneumonia. So that's where we're at, and life goes on. There was no shutdown, and the reasons for that are very interesting. 40% of the Nicaraguan population are campesinos, mostly in the subsistence economy. They can't stop working, much less in April and May when they're planting their crop that they live off of, the first crop. Plus they have to go out to look for the firewood, look for the eggs, milk the cow, lots of things. They can't stay in the house all of the time. Then 80% of the urban workers are informal sector who earn their daily bread daily. And if they don't work, there's no food on the family table. So they were protected too by keeping economic activity going, no lockdown. And then there were the students. The schools have not been shut at any moment. The private schools, they can do virtual education because their students have the wherewithal to do it. The poor kids in the public schools don't have the computer equipment nor the household conditions in most cases to do virtual education. Now we're continually hearing about the damage done to even the students in good conditions by not having in-presence education, psychologically, emotionally, in terms of stunted social development, in terms of suicide. So the necessity of in-place education is being stressed. And I think that, ironically, the world is coming around to the Nicaraguan position, that it's going to have to live with these things, learn how to deal with them without closing down the economy, without locking down the population. If there's a lesson to be drawn from all of this, it's that public health matters. Public health hasn't been prioritized, and a huge cost is being paid for the lack of priority in public health. Just like individual health is the basis of all our daily activities, public health is the basis of production, consumption, commerce, exports, competitiveness, education, sports, social activities. Everything depends on public health, and yet it's had a low priority. We must struggle for that to become universal public health. And now with this vaccine thing, and here I will finish on this subject, the vaccine nationalism is so short-sighted. Because if this virus exists anywhere in the world, it will keep mutating, and it will come back to bite them in the rear if you let it exist anywhere. You've got to get that vaccine out to everywhere. This virus has to be defeated everywhere, or it will out-mutate us. It will change faster than we can with our vaccines. So we need a very fast